Hello, we're so glad you joined us for a walk in the garden. I'm Penny Lewis, Executive Director of the Ecological Landscape Alliance. Welcome to gardeners across the United States and to our international guests. As we continue to cope with the challenges of the coronavirus, we hope that these weekly virtual garden walks will add a bit of beauty to your day and inspire you to visit, create, and enjoy area gardens when you're able. Today I'd like to introduce Dan Jaffe Wilder, whose garden walk will introduce us to tenacious plants for tough places. Dan is a horticulturalist, ecologist, plant propagator, photographer, and author. Dan is passionate about ecological horticulture, building both sustainable and wildlife value into every landscape, and the foraging and cultivation of wild edible plants. He's the horticulturalist, propagator, and staff photographer for Norcross Wildlife Sanctuary in Massachusetts. Dan is also the co-author of Native Plants for New England Gardens. Welcome, Dan.
Thanks, Penny. Welcome, everyone. It's nice to talk to you. I wish I could see you, but this will have to do for now. This is going to be tenacious plants for tough places. This has always been a topic that's kind of near and dear to my heart. I've never been one for your delicate sort of garden plants. When you've got the option between a staghorn sumac and a lady slipper, I tended to pick the sumac. I like plants that can take care of themselves, that can thrive without, kind of the need for really a whole lot of work on our part. And that's where a lot of these plants come in. It's pretty easy for plants to thrive when you've got, moist, well-drained soils and good sun and good organic matter. But when things get a little more challenging, you need a different set of plants. So with that in mind, let's kind of just jump right into this. So when I first got into gardening, this was kind of what I had in mind. I didn't really know much at the time, and I thought gardens were either vegetable gardens that, I don't know if anyone's ever had a garden that looks like the top right. I've always found that it looks like that pretty much the day you plant it, and then after that, everything goes to hell. And the bottom right, these are both pictures I just found on the internet, is, your kind of classic, perfect little woodland garden. And these are maintenance spaces. It takes a lot of work to keep things looking this clean. That being said, a lot of us deal with challenges on the landscape. Some of these challenges are things that we all deal with. Some of them are a little more kind of site specific. I tend to live and work pretty much in the middle of nowhere, so I rarely have tiny spaces to deal with. Instead, I've got the opposite problem where I've got 75 acres to manage. And so planting, hepaticas on 75 acres kind of gets a little lost. And so we've all got these special challenges that we need to kind of figure out in order to kind of, solve. So how do we do it? That's where these kind of, tougher, tenacious plants kind of kick in. And I think kind of, a basic definition on what we're going to talk about today, these plants are going to really be determined by the space in question. So, we might call a tenacious plant one that could push back against an invasive, but that's not going to be the same as a plant that, say, will grow in really, really thin soils. So clearly we need to kind of figure out what we're defining here. And this comes back to that kind of golden rule. I think a lot of people have heard this before. It's the idea of right plant, right place. So this is an easy rule to follow when we're talking about good gardens. It becomes a lot more challenging when we start talking about green roofs and parking lot islands and roadsides. So the kind of question posed here is you've got two plants that we're comparing, Monarda didyma, this is bee balm, and Senna heberacarpa, which is usually just called wild senna. They're both great plants, but they both grow in very, very different conditions. If you had the two to choose from and you had sunny, dry sites, you probably don't want to be planting Monarda. Monarda in sunny, dry sites tends to look like this. You get a whole lot of powdery mildew. Monarda didyma likes moist soils, and when it gets stressed out, it gets powdery mildew. Senna, on the other hand, is perfectly fine growing in these very dry sites. And so this is kind of where we start getting an idea of what we mean by a tough plant. A tough plant is a plant that will perform well in a tough place. It's one that will fulfill your goals for that site. And that second part is a little important. You may want a plant that will simply cover the area. That's one sort of goal, and that's where something like that staghorn sumac I mentioned a moment ago might be a really good choice. You might also want a plant that can thrive in these really challenging conditions, but won't cover the entire space. Something that maybe does very well, but doesn't, say, spread. In which case you might be looking at something more like a stiff aster or, a little bluestem instead of the staghorn sumac. So where we talk about right plant, right place in typical garden settings, that also really holds true for this kind of, tough places sort of conditions. We need to figure out what we're trying to do with the site and then what plants will survive there. So the next part is, are we talking about weeds? I talk about things like staghorn sumac, and I know a lot of times that's not necessarily a good choice for a lot of different spaces. What we're getting at here with these tough places is that these plants that might be weedy in one area might be exactly what we need in another. So this picture here is a picture of probably a Siberian iris with some hay-scented fern, kind of running through the middle of it. I think it's pretty safe to say that the gardener that owns this space would consider hay-scented fern a weed. What about this space, though? This is in Sudbury, Massachusetts. This is around a reservoir that I used to hike at when I lived out in that area. It was a damaged landscape, very, very deer, kind of browsed, and that's part of the reason why so much of this hay-scented fern was existing. So it was also a heavily invaded area. Lots of buckthorn here, and this area where the hay-scented form had fully colonized, the buckthorn was not growing. The buckthorn seed, I'm sure, would drop into it, but the hay-scented fern kept it repressed. And so we had a patch of this very strong spreading native plant instead of a patch of an invasive species. In the top picture, I would label hay-scented fern a weed. In the bottom picture, I would label hay-scented fern an ally. So this is kind of getting back to that. We can't just call a plant the right plant. We've got to define that place. So when we're talking about tough places, in many cases, we're going to be talking about plants that you would not want to put in a place that was not labeled as a tough place. That being said, that plant might be perfect considering the conditions you're dealing with. So keep that in mind as we go through this and I start recommending species, because some of them are going to be plants that I would not put in a garden. So top here, we've got staghorn sumac, edge of a field. This is, I think, a great use for staghorn sumac. You can see on the right there, clearly that field is maintained. Someone's in there mowing it, who knows how often. The staghorn sumac, though, once it gets into that kind of tall woody phase, is a pretty tough mow job. But if you catch it, repeatedly through the season, it stays herbaceous. You could run it over with a basic lawnmower, and it's well maintained and performing quite a useful, ecological value there on the edge. Bottom right here is a mixture of various different goldenrods. Looks like we got some milkweed in there. Kind of a wild meadow. Neither what I'll call Solidago rugosa on the bottom, as if I could actually identify that species from that picture, but let's call it rugosa, nor the staghorn sumac on the top are what we typically think of as garden plants, but they are useful plants when we're dealing with tough conditions. So, what are these tough conditions? Clearly not a picture from New England here, but sunny, dry sites is a common New England problem. We have a lot of glacially, kind of affected landscapes. And with these glacial landscapes, you get a lot of grit and gravel and sand, and there's a lot of well-drained sites. And so these sort of thin soils, especially when they're partnered with full sun, can really lead towards troublesome landscapes. Landscapes that need a very special set of plants that will thrive in these areas that might not thrive elsewhere. This is one that jumps right to mind. This is one I use at home in my gardens here at Norcross and in a variety of different places. This is Augustache funiculum, the anise hyssop. This is the species I tend to call out because it's the one that I find most people can get their hands on. You can find this in just about any nursery around here. Two other species that I really like to work with but are definitely tougher to find, Augustache nepetoides, the catnip giant hyssop, and Augustache scrophularifolia, which is what is the common name on that one? I think it's just purple giant hyssop. Those are both, native species to New England, both rare in New England and uncommon in terms of, being available through the horticultural industry. But this one, on the other hand, is quite common. This is a mint family plant. It's native, depending on how you want to argue about the definition of native. I'm not going to get into that argument today because we don't have hours. My simple version is I really don't care about where it lies on the map. I care about building habitat. I want to know that what I plant is beneficial on the landscape, and this plant most certainly is. It's a good source of nectar for butterflies. It's a good source of nectar for some of our less common, more specialized bees. It's also quite a tasty plant. You can make a very decent tea out of this. It also makes a fantastic yogurt sauce. And it's a plant that will grow very happily if you give it kind of sunny, moist conditions, it will spread very vigorously. If you give it sunny, dry conditions, it becomes a little more kind of restrained and will still grow and thrive quite happily. And that tends to be where I find myself using it. The picture on the right here is the flower well after the flower. This is, I guess, now passing fruit. And what the point I'm trying to make here is that this is a plant that anybody can grow from seed without needing really anything. I will often leave this plant to pass its flower, to go to seed, and then I'll walk around my landscape collecting these seed heads and just look for bare areas on the landscape, and I'll literally just shake the seed head above the bare soil. Seed will drop right out of that, seed head, and by next spring, I've got seedlings germinating and growing and filling in spaces. This is not one you need to be any sort of professional propagator in order to grow. Allium cernuum, this is one of we have a number of different native onions, and I'm kind of enamored by them. I don't know what it is about the onion family that I've always really appreciated. I'm sure the fact that I can eat them all is part of it, but there's a little more to it than that. This picture shows you well why it's called nodding onion. We have another closely related species, Allium canadense, which is, no one calls it the nodding onion, but you might as well call it that. Once they're in bloom, they look almost identical, but it never nods over quite like this. As they start blooming, that nod becomes less and less pronounced until it fully opens its flower, in which case it's standing almost entirely erect. By time you see fruit set on it, the flower is standing completely erect, and you will get these seeds forming. This is one that, again, with open soils, will happily seed around, does very well in sunny, dry sites, is also perfectly fine with, a touch of shade if it's on, say, the edge of a meadow, or in, non-thin soils. That being said, it's very happy in thin soils. It's also remarkably tasty. In the early season, the leaves are often used just kind of raw in kind of salads or thrown onto, say, a plate of scrambled eggs or something like that. What I actually like to do, let me go back a few pictures. You can see here in this first image, those long, narrow leaves. I will often just cut those right at the very bottom and throw them into a soup entirely whole, maybe cut in half. And it turns out to pretty much be a long, green, almost spaghetti that tastes like onion. It's a unique texture and form that oftentimes when I feed it to people, if they're unfamiliar with the plant, they're questioning, what they're actually eating. Is it pasta that I've somehow dyed green and put onion into, or it can really be quite nice that way. And later in the season, they get tough enough where you're probably going to want to cook them anyway. Okay, here it is this is a picture from Garden in the Woods a number of years ago. And what you see here is what we had done is we had planted, this is a berm, not that you can tell in this image, but this is a built berm. And we planted pretty much a line of these onions on the top of the berm and then did nothing to them. And they just, they would flower and they would produce seed, and that seed would drop, and they just kind of seeded their way down the berm. And then they seeded their way into this carex lawn that we were growing, which was quite nice because we would wait in early spring, allow them to bloom, and then we'd mow them back. And their greens were narrow enough where they just blended right into the lawn. And for the rest of the season, when we kept the lawn maintained as a lawn of sorts, you couldn't even tell they were there. So it really worked kind of nicely in that manner. Antennaria in general, the pussy toes, the genus, are all really quite tolerant of these sunny, dry conditions. With the exception of this one species here, I'd say they're all very slow growing. Antennaria neglecta, Antennaria microphylla, Antennaria rosea, they're all different species that are quite slow growing. This one, on the other hand, Antennaria plataginifolia, is much more robust. It's not as robust as, say, the hay-scented fern or the staghorn sumac that I was mentioning earlier, but compared to the other Antennarias, it's running a race. And I find that really quite useful, especially when we're talking about these challenging conditions. I want something that will fill in pretty quickly. There's definitely a place for delicate, slow-growing plants, but today's lecture is not it. Today is about plants that can fill areas, that can cover space, and can handle very adverse conditions. And though the other species of Antennarias can handle these same conditions, Plataginifolia is very good at filling in those conditions, and I really love it for that. It's got this broad leaf compared to the other species. They're coated in a very fine layer of small white hairs. It gives it that kind of silvery appearance. This is it in the early season as it's just starting to produce its flowers. The flowers on it aren't particularly showy in your kind of typical flower way, but instead they have a really nice kind of soft texture that I find quite intriguing. As the flower itself opens, you will often see little bits of red in there. The stamens are often tinged red. It's not a red flower. It's still definitely a white flower, but you get kind of a color texture going on. This is also this is the preferred host plant for the Vanessa butterflies. That's our, I'm blanking on the name, Vanessa virginiensis and Vanessa carlucii. Yeah, blanking on the name. Folks, I'm a plant guy who's learning my insects, if that's not already obvious. But this is an important host plant, and there's probably about 200 of you yelling at your screen right now giving me the common name. So someone punch it into the chat box for me. Butterfly milkweed so we've got a variety of different milkweeds in the area. With the exception of swamp milkweed, all of them are perfectly content growing in these kind of sunny, dry conditions. Swamp milkweed will actually grow reasonably well in those conditions, but there's better options. This is definitely one of them. Butterfly milkweed is I'd say the best behaved, commonly available milkweed for sunny, dry sites. There's other ones like the green milkweed and the world milkweed that you need to kind of know someone to get your hands on and are challenging to grow. This one is slow growing, but by no means challenging. Forms a nice tight clump, is not one to cover an area thickly the way, say, common milkweed can. We'll get to that one a little later in the lecture. What I'm really enamored by in this one is this color. You cannot find this vibrant red-orange color in anything else kind of within our plant flora. Here's the common milkweed. That I'm just going to kind of briefly mention now because we'll talk about it a little bit later on. The real difference between these two, other than the obvious color differences, is on the left, Asclepias tuberosa is a clumping species that will grow slowly in an area and will just kind of fill in and take that one area up. It may seed around a little bit, but it does it slowly and kind of quietly. Asclepias syriaca, the common milkweed on the right, is a spreader. It's a pretty vigorous plant. Seeds around. Well, actually, it doesn't seed around all that much, but it spreads via rhizomes, and it does that quite well. They're both beautiful in their own way in the late season. This is something that I never used to appreciate when I kind of first got into landscaping. And for those of you who don't know me, my first kind of bout into landscaping was like mow and blow crews and planting invasive species and covering everything in red mulch. And at the time, I definitely didn't see beauty in, say, the fruiting body of a milkweed. It's something that has developed over time where I start seeing things like this and seeing the texture on them and finding them really quite intriguing. It's also something that if I don't necessarily want, say, common milkweed spreading around, I will take these heads and bring them inside and put them into a dried flower vase and watch them kind of open up as they dry and enjoy them in that way. And whenever possible, I will collect these seeds and spread them to new areas and spread the common milkweed around. So most people who know Baptisia know this species here, Baptisia australis, the guy on the left, and less people know Baptisia tinctoria, the guy on the right. So as far as a New England range, tinctoria is one that comes into our area naturally. Australis is one that is native more to the Appalachian region and to parts west of New England. That being said, they are both fantastic plants, whether you're in New England or outside of New England. These are great plants for sunny, dry sites. Australis especially really doesn't do well if it's not given sunny, dry sites. If the conditions are too rich, it'll often get too big for its own good, and then it'll just kind of flop over. And I've seen plants that, instead of getting 3.5 feet tall, will get 4.5 feet tall and then just kind of open up because they can't, support themselves anymore. So I really try and restrict Baptisia to these thin soils where they're really well adapted and they do quite well. Both of these are fantastic plants for butterfly value on the landscape, and both of them are really quite nice looking. I tend to plant them together because I think the blue and the yellow is a nice combination, and they both have similar sort of both aesthetic and ecological value on the landscape, and clearly can both grow in the same conditions. Give them space. This is not a plant for a small area. It's not one to really spread around strongly, but each plant is going to get at least 3 feet tall and about 4 feet wide in time. They're slow at first, but in time they want that area. I've always been a big fan of this one. In general, if we're talking about Euphorbia on the East Coast, we're usually either referring to a native weed or a non-native invasive species. This is the one exception to the rule. This is Euphorbia corollata. If we've got any folks in the kind of western and upper New York region, you probably know this plant better than most New Englanders do. It spreads it gets into kind of very western New England, and then from there moves west through the Midwest. It's quite common as you get towards kind of prairie sort of regions of the country. It's been kind of jokingly referred to as the native baby's breath. It's a mass of these small white flowers, absolutely loved by some of our native pollinating flies and some of the smaller bees within our native kind of fauna. It's a really nice but slow-growing plant, very happy growing in these thin, dry soils. Whether it's thin and dry or rich and moist, it's a slow-growing species. It will seed around, but it'll take its sweet time doing it. I find this actually works really well combined with native annuals and native short-lived perennials, because as they eventually start to dissipate, this one has had enough time to really kind of fill in and do nicely. It's also one of those few herbaceous perennials that gives you a consistently beautiful fall color. The foliage will start to color up pretty much after the fruits have matured, and then we'll hold these kind of red and orange and purple hues up until the point where all the trees have started turning beautiful colors as well. This is a common trait in our woody flora and less common in the herbaceous flora, but there are a few good standouts, and this is one of them. Monarda punctata has become my favorite bee balm, probably because I am rarely working in the sort of rich, or moist soils where the common bee balm, Monarda didyma, really thrives. Instead, I work in a lot of conditions that are very thin and sunny and sandy and dry, and Monarda punctata really thrives there. This is a short-lived species. Before that turns anyone off, a lot of people hear that and they think, oh, I don't want a short-lived species, I want a long-term perennial. They don't realize the advantages that short-term species can really provide us. I have planted this in sites where it has persisted for, 15 years, and that's as long as I've been planting plants on the landscape. It can last much, much longer. Though each individual plant may only live 2, 3, maybe 4 years, the population can persist long-term without any trouble at all. All it really needs is the right site, and in this case, the right site is thin soils. It needs the sort of conditions where the flora in the area, the other kind of plants, are not completely filling in a space because the soils are thin enough where you don't have that thick growth that you might get in, say, a rich woodland garden. And that means there's open soil. And what this plant is very good at doing is producing flowers, producing seed, dropping seed, and germinating right in place. And so you can get long-lived populations from this plant when it's planted in an area with some open soil. In garden settings, if you want to grow this one, what I simply recommend people do is when you see it starting to go into fruit, go around underneath it and just kind of, scrape your soil. Create some disturbance underneath it as it's dropping its seed, and then you will also have, rejuvenation in your area on a regular basis. It is a pollinator powerhouse. This is the great yellow digger wasp. This is Sphex icomonius, I believe. It's one of the few insects I actually know the botanical, or I guess it's not botanical, scientific name of, so I'm very proud of my poor insect knowledge. This is its close cousin. This is Sphex pennsylvanicus. This is the black digger wasp. Both of these guys look mean as heck. They are not. The one on the right there, the yellow one, kept hiding underneath that bract there, and I kept having to poke it with my finger to get it into the frame so I could take the picture. It ignored my multiple pokes. It was much more interested in the flower. These are predatory wasps. They're the ones that control a lot of the would-be pests in our garden. So they are most certainly the good guys, the ones that we'd love to see more of on the landscape. This is one of the goldenrod crab spiders who's feeding on one of our bumblebees. I don't know which bumblebee that is. Maybe Bombus impatiens, but I'm only guessing because that's a really common one. So ignore the species and just write Pycnanthemum on your list. Or speaking of lists, there is a handout associated with this. I'm sorry, I should have mentioned that earlier. It's available, downloadable through the GoToWebinar app. You should be able to see it and you can download it. And if not, we can always get it to you later. All right, moving on. Pycnanthemum, the mountain mints, are a fantastic genus in general. I have yet to meet a Pycnanthemum that I don't like. This one here, Tenuifolium, the narrowleaf mountain mint, is what I would describe as one of the really better behaved species. It is capable of growing in these thin, dry soils. It's a pretty slow grower, takes its time to fill in. It makes it useful if you're looking for a plant that acts that way. It's also quite useful in any typical garden settings. You give this one good soil and it's still a reasonably slow grower, which is something that you don't tend to find with a lot of the mints. And so it makes this quite a useful plant. Pycnanthemum clinopoides, this is a less common one. This is one that the taxonomists have been arguing over for years as to whether or not it's its own species or whether it's a hybrid of other species. I think it's probably safe to say this is most likely a hybrid because it's sterile. And sterility is not something that tends to naturally occur unless we're talking about a hybrid of two different species. But it's a pretty cool species nonetheless. Sorry, I thought I had some other ones in there. I think it's on the list, Pycnanthemum muticum, broadleaf mountain mint, which might be my favorite species. It's on the other end of the spectrum compared to tenuifolium. It is a stronger spreader. It's one that is capable of growing both in these very thin, dry soils that we're talking about, as well as in moist areas. It really can run that gamut. As long as it's sunny, it's happy to grow there. And will spread more strongly. It's one I've actually used quite effectively when I've been weeding out something like goutweed or this spreading bellflower, and I want a good, vigorous, herbaceous native plant that I can put in that place to help really push back against, a would-be reinvader. So I think a lot of people know black-eyed Susans in general. This species here, Rudbeckia hirta, is probably my favorite of the black-eyed Susans. This is another one of those kind of short-lived species as compared to, say, Rudbeckia fulgida, which is more of a traditional perennial. What I like about hirta is it's very good about seeding around and finding the holes in the landscape. I use this quite regularly in meadow conditions where there might be some disturbance, whether it be mowing disturbance, tractor disturbance, foot traffic, digging animals, whatever. And this becomes my seed bank. And I'll find a lot of the times as, holes appear in the landscape from whatever disturbance you might talk about, the Rudbeckia hirta and other short-lived perennials are what will quickly reconstitute that area. That becomes quite nice because there will always be these sorts of plants on the landscape. And I would rather have Rudbeckia hirta coming up when I dig a hole in the landscape than, say, dock and chickweed and mullein and your other traditional kind of short-lived, fast-spreading, seed-dispersed, weeds in this case. Rudbeckia triloba, this is a different species. This one is a bit more of a true perennial than hirta. Still a little shorter-lived compared to, say, fulgida, but definitely longer-lived than hirta. As I said before, short-lived doesn't mean the population is short-lived, just the individual. Triloba, the brown-eyed Susan, which I don't know why they call it brown-eyed, but sure, why not, is a nice species. It's got this trilobe leaf you can't quite see here. It happens in the lower leaves. Gives it a nice texture that's a bit different from a lot of the other plants, and so when it's not in bloom, I still find it kind of texturally interesting. And these red stems against the dark green leaf are pretty consistent on this one, and again, add this sort of color texture that you see even when the flower's not there, and then just add a nice contrast when the flower does exist. Just a little less well-known Rudbeckia that I think more people should get to know and work with. Just to throw one more at you, Rudbeckia laccionata. Is another great species. I find that everyone knows Rudbeckia fulgida and doesn't realize that we've got 3, 4, 5 other species within the genus that are all fantastic in different sort of ways. And one of the ways I often find myself finding new plants is I pick my favorite plant and then go, pull out a flora and see what other members of that genus might exist in my area that I should get to know. And oftentimes I find really fun plants that way. Rudbeckia triloba was found that way. Monarda punctata was found that way. It's something that I think we can all be doing, and then pass the information on. This is Rudbeckia hirta again. What I like about hirta and many of these short-lived perennials is that as a short-lived perennial, each individual is quickly going to produce seed and drop its seed and then germinate in place. And with this constant fluctuation of seed stock comes a constant mixing of genetic material. And that makes them quite adaptable to changing conditions. It also means that their phenotypic abilities change. So you get different forms showing up somewhat regularly. For example, excuse me, a lot of you probably know Rudbeckia hirta and think, well, mine don't ever turn orange in the center. That's something that appeared at Garden in the Woods years ago. It was something that I found, got really excited about, and as a short-lived perennial, it's something that we enjoyed for 2 years, and then it disappeared. But I collected seed off of that individual and would sow that seed in areas separate from the others, and found that not all of the daughter generation would come out with orange tinges, but quite a few of them would. And so you can kind of help to, kind of enhance these sort of color variants, or sometimes you find a a rolled flower, or you find flowers that bloom a little shorter or a little later. This sort of diversity in bloom time and shape and structure of the flower not only adds interest to the landscape, but also adds diversity and sustainability to the landscape. You'll find that sometimes a plant that blooms a little bit later might miss that early season frost, or one that blooms a little bit taller might kind of stand up and get better pollinated. And this sort of diverse genotype that we can find on landscapes can really help, especially in a changing climate. Also notice here the holes in our flowers and our leaves here. This is a plant that is an active part of the landscape. I want to see holes in my plants, because this is what the native insects do to our plants. They form a few holes where you step back and it's still an absolutely beautiful flower. But one where you can also see, hey, this flower is an active player on the landscape. It's forming a function. It's a part of the living landscape. You don't tend to see that on non-native plants that don't interact with our flora. A sterile plant that is perfect all throughout the year and produces fruit that nobody wants to eat and just doesn't really kind of play that ecological role. It's ironic that when I was back in my mow and blow days, I would see this as a problem, and I look at it now and see this as so much more beautiful than a plant that is untouched by the insects. Little bluestem is one of my kind of go-to filler sort of grasses. There are a lot of really wonderful kind of native grasses, and I don't think I could ever pick a favorite, but if someone was really twisting my arm about it, the little bluestem could very well, come out of my mouth. This is a wonderful species. It's tolerant of growing in the sort of conditions that we're dealing with in this section of this lecture, these sunny, dry sites. It's one that you can, if not being the fastest plant to grow this way, you can, buy yourself a bag of seed and simply sow it out into a meadow you're building, and it will, fill in time. So it's not one you necessarily need to start in plugs or go to the nursery and buy 2-quart pots in. It's got beautiful kind of seed heads that, instead of forming as a single mass the way, say, a miscanthus can or one of our native andropogons, you get this mass of small seed kind of tufts that form up and down the stem. And then the colors in fall can be really quite beautiful. These tinges of red and orange, sometimes going into kind of purple and then tinges of blue, depending on, the time of year. It can really be a wonderful grass. It's also an important source of food for some of our less common butterflies, and actually more the moths are what I'm thinking of. If I remember correctly, I think it's the Promethea and maybe the eel moth that'll feed on this plant in their caterpillar phase before becoming the moth that actually doesn't feed on anything. Okay, we're talking about tough places. I'd say lawns are one of the tough places that I would love to fill in. If anyone's ever seen one of my lectures, you've probably heard me rant about lawns, so I won't go into it too deeply. But I hate lawns. I think we need to replace them with something better. I'm not going to say all lawns need to go, but I think a large number of them could go, and it's for a lot of these reasons. We dump a lot of herbicides on our lawns every year. We dump a lot of fertilizer on lawns, and not only lawns, but on this kind of large-scale agriculture. That 2 million pounds is not lawns alone, but it's simply run off into the Gulf of Mexico, which is a problem of a variety of different things. And that runoff leads to the Gulf Dead Zone, which is an awful, awful thing. It's exactly what it sounds like. Everything in the area dies, and you get this massive dead zone, which is not a good thing. We waste massive amounts of water every single day, 9 billion gallons of water every day on lawns alone in America. That is a staggering number. To put that into perspective, if we could somehow get that water anywhere in the world, we could pretty much solve the world's clean drinking water problems. We could give every single person on this planet who's currently lacking clean drinking water 7 gallons every single day if we stopped watering our lawns. That, as far as I'm concerned, is a much better use of water than watering a plant that is not native, does not support any sort of ecosystem function, and requires all of these herbicides and pesticides in order to survive in our area. Lawns need to go already. So we need to replace them. And if we're going to be replacing them, I want something that functions. I'd love to say just replace them with gardens, but that doesn't work in every place. In some places, we need some sort of a lawn, something that works in this way. And so I want something that doesn't need to be watered. I'm perfectly fine with watering absolutely any plant I put in the ground when it's first establishing. Everything needs help at the beginning. After it's established, I don't want to water anymore. As I mentioned earlier, I manage 75 acres. I don't have time to water gardens. I need to plant gardens that are as close to self-sustaining as possible. I do not fertilize the landscape. It's one thing to, mix some compost into your soil or, throw fertilizer into your, kind of greenhouse where you're growing plants in sterile media and, those sorts of conditions. But once plants are on the landscape, if you're picking plants that are well adapted to your conditions, you should not need to be putting any fertilizer down on the landscape. Notice how that would not work for lawns, which is why I can say they're not well adapted to our landscape. We're talking about feeding the ecosystem, building living landscapes. I keep saying that. That's a term that I think Doug Tallamy and Rick Dark coined in one of their more recent books. It's a fantastic book if you haven't read it already. And what I mean by that is I want a landscape that builds habitat. So clearly I don't want to be putting pesticides or herbicides down if I'm trying to attract life to these plants. I don't want them coming into contact with these products. I want to feed life. I want to feed pollinators. I want to feed me whenever possible. And if it's going to be a lawn, it's got to tolerate at least some foot traffic. Some lawns need to tolerate heavy foot traffic. Some can tolerate, light foot traffic. And this really depends on the location we're talking about and what you expect to do with the space that you might be thinking about right now. So if you want a lawn that still looks like what we think of as a lawn, Carex pennsylvanica is a really good option. This is a native sedge. It's a rhizomatous spreader that naturally grows in pine woodlands. And what that means in terms of practical use on the landscape is this is a plant that will grow in thin soils, will spread to fill in without a need to constantly reseed. That means you could dig holes in it and it'll fill right back in, and you can take those plants you just dug up and move them to new areas. It also means it does not need watering, fertilizing, or anything other than a once-a-year mowing to keep it pretty much small. Puts on all of its growth in the early season. So if you mow it, say, first day of summer, it's going to stay that same height for the rest of the season. One mowing is a whole lot less than a typical kind of, lawn regimen tends to get. My favorite, I think, of the kind of new lawn alternatives are wild strawberries. This is something that we built when I was at Garden in the Woods. It's something I'm building here at Norcross in the new edible garden that I'd love to say you should all come see, but, well, maybe once this whole virus epidemic passes us by, then you can all come see it. This is a plant that works very, very well in place of a lawn. This picture here on the right is it as a lawn. This is something that can handle quite heavy foot traffic. The previous species, Carex pennsylvanica, can handle light foot traffic, but if we're talking about heavy foot traffic, it's going to decline. At home, where I have a strawberry lawn, it handles free-range chickens, 2 dogs, one that likes to dig, and the fact that me and my friends and my wife hang out on the lawn pretty much every day that it's nice out. We abuse our lawn, and we do not fertilize it, and we mow it pretty much once a year just to keep the tree seedlings out, and we don't ever water it. And it takes all of that. This is also an extremely valuable plant ecologically. Not just for the obvious reason that you might think of in the form of these berries, which are very, very tasty for us. But look at these leaves. Notice the leaves underneath this, the berry bowl. See how ratty they are? This plant supports, at least in my part of Massachusetts, the numbers that I've been able to find, it supports 87 different species of various different caterpillars that turn into our native butterflies and moths. That is a very, very high number for a herbaceous plant. Compare that to bee balm, which is, by the way, a great pollinator plant. Bee balm supports 8 different species. Wild strawberry supports 87. The only herbaceous genus that beats out the wild strawberries, at least in New England, are the goldenrods. That is a very, very valuable plant. And now we're talking about a plant that could replace a would-be lawn that is pretty much an ecological disaster and instead build something that can be an ecological powerhouse while also feeding us, which is a really nice added bonus as far as I'm concerned. Its ability to tolerate such heavy foot traffic is because of its vigor. Fragaria virginiana, wild strawberry, the guy on the right there, is a strong spreading plant. Makes it quite a useful ground cover under, say, a woody-dominated landscape, but it also means that you want to be careful where you plant it if it, say, abuts a very delicate garden space. It will spread into your garden space. That's what it does. That's why it's able to tolerate the abuse that we give it in, say, lawn settings. So you got to kind of decide where to put it. If you like the idea of a perennial, ecologically viable native strawberry that's never ever heard of strawberry blight and does all these great things, but you don't have the place for a vigorous spreader, the plant on your left is a really good alternative. Fragaria vesca, the woodland strawberry, which really doesn't grow in woodlands, but why the heck not, is really more of a clumping species. That's what I'm trying to show in this picture here. You notice how there's a lack of running stolons on the picture on the left, whereas on the right, it ran all over the place and formed a lawn for us. Vesca is a little more challenging to find, but if you start looking for it, it's not too difficult. Just make sure if you're talking native that you find yourself Fragaria vesca variety Americana. Fragaria vesca variety vesca is a European species that's commonly sold as a tasty, non-native kind of, wouldn't call it an agricultural plant, but as a perennial edible species. We have both a native subspecies and then there's a non-native subspecies, both of which are good clumpings. Okay, let's get out of the sunny, dry sites and get into the shade. So in terms of these kind of, these shade-tolerant species, one of the problem areas I'd say in the shade are the dry shade areas. And I'm going to really kind of focus on that, although it won't be entirely dedicated to that. Actea racemosa, this is black cohosh. It's ironic that this plant is actually quite rare in the wild. In the wild, it is restricted to somewhat higher pH, higher nutrient, higher organic matter, often kind of, riverside or streamside communities. That being said, you can take this exact same species and plant it under hemlock trees, pine trees, acidic, dry, very shaded woodlands, and it does very, very well. It's a plant that will sometimes seed around on the landscape, and when I worked at Garden in the Woods, we would often deadhead this one in the woodland garden where we grew our trilliums, and then we would take all that seed and go throw it in the woods, where we weren't, say, growing a bunch of trilliums, where we wanted it to spread as vigorously as possible. So you can kind of decide where you might want to allow this one to spread and where you don't want it to spread by pretty much deciding where you let the seed mature and where you move the seed to. It's not one that the seed will often take 2 years to come up, but once that 2-year period starts kind of elapsing, you'll start finding seedlings on a regular basis. They're very easy to move around, and this plant gets pretty big. So it's good at filling in spaces. It's also good at, taking over your trillium beds if you, plant it in amongst the trilliums. Well, if you plant it in amongst the trilliums and don't manage it. But it's a fantastic plant when you're looking to fill areas where things don't tend to grow very well. It's one of my favorite species, and the bees agree with me. When this thing's in bloom, it is absolutely covered in just about every bee I can identify. Here's it in its full form. You can see the size of it. Those flowers will often be taller than I am when all said and done. You've usually got somewhere in about the range of, I'd say, 3.5 foot tall and probably 4 foot wide of foliar kind of density at the base with a flower spike sticking through that. There are a variety of other closely related species, different acteas. The baneberries are acteas. There's also ones like Actea rubrifolia, Actea podocarpa. These are other kind of, related species. None of them are nearly as vigorous and as tolerant of difficult conditions as this one here, black cohosh, Actea racemosa. So I can't just say asters because it's such a diverse group that they grow in sun, in shade, in dry, and moist. So we'll kind of lump them together as asters for the shade. There is a group of asters referred to as the wood asters, which actually is kind of a broad enough term to hit a couple different genera. This one here, they used to all be asters. They're all changing now. So this is now Euphorbia divaricata. This is the white wood aster. It's the same picture as the one on the right, that kind of group there. This is probably the most vigorous of the of our wood asters. It's one that I put in areas where I'm really having trouble growing things or areas where I want something filling in quite thickly. It's a good plant for that purpose completely. If you want something that is tolerant to very difficult conditions but a little less strongly spreading, Symphyiotrichum cordifolium here, the blue wood aster, is a little bit better behaved and just as tolerant to tough conditions. Frankly, I think they work wonderfully together, and I often plant them both together. As I said, I manage large landscapes, so I tend to like plants that'll spread. That being said, I recognize that not everybody has 75 acres to deal with, so if you've got a smaller space, you may want to go with the blue wood aster over the white wood aster. Both fantastic plants, both incredibly valuable, both for the native Lepidoptera as well as bees, and a variety of flies, and the beetles and ants aren't too unhappy either. Okay, so there's certain common problem areas in New England. There's a lot of them that could go into, say, the 4-hour version of this lecture instead of the 1 hour. But the kind of the short version gives us sunny roadsides as probably one of the most common ones. You know, how many roadsides do we drive down that are full of nothing more than kind of European turf grasses that are kind of surviving, kind of not, and could really be something better? And these sorts of conditions are really challenging. These need to be areas where we can have, you know, oftentimes these are areas where people are pulling over their cars, so compaction is very common, pollution is very common. You know, you get a lot of random junk in here. You get salt spray kicking in. You get, you know, kind of sand getting, you know, piled onto these plants from the salt trucks that lay down sand and then gets kind of plowed off. These are not conditions where you can really put anything on the verge of delicate. So this is where I break out the big guns. This is where I put the plants that I would never put in a typical garden setting. Solidago canadensis, Asclepias syriaca, these are vigorous spreading species. Not good for small spaces, but absolutely fantastic for areas where you just want something that'll spread as strongly as possible and can function on an ecological basis. These are exceptionally important plants from a wildlife point of view, and they will stand up to the sort of conditions that roadsides offer. I often combine those two with Eragrostis spectabilis. The purple lovegrass, this is another one of those short-lived species that'll seed around. If you're driving down the highway in the middle of summer and you see pretty much what looks like a red haze growing low on the ground, you're looking at this plant. It's one that has made its way into pretty much failed roadside lawns and has, you know, kind of colonized these areas quite readily. It's a fantastic plant for these sorts of conditions and works really well when we're talking about difficult landscapes, as long as they're on that kind of sunny and well-drained side of things. Parking lot islands. This is a picture I took when I lived back in Framingham. I always thought this was funny because clearly it's a landscape that someone has tried to landscape. You know, they put out a planting box. There's a whole bunch of dead PJM rhododendrons that are stuck in full sun and really are not happy. In fact, the only plants that are doing well is the celastris and the native butterfly weed. These are challenging conditions. Oftentimes, parking lot islands are planted with annual bedding plants and surrounded in red mulch. The annual bedding plants will die 2 or 3 times and are replaced 2 or 3 times until the landscape company gives up and simply pours more red mulch down, and you have parking lot islands that are nothing but mulch. In that case, you might as well just, you know, well, there's no point in making an island out of it. But we have these areas, and we can cultivate these areas. We just need the sort of plants that can handle these sorts of conditions. Very similar conditions to what we just talked about on the roadside. Not necessarily as compacted or as polluted, but in many cases they are. Sumacs are one of my favorites. Rus aromatica is the well-behaved one of the group, still tolerant of the sort of conditions that we're talking about here, but also well enough behaved that this one can make its way into garden settings. Fragrant sumac, it doesn't have the flower or the fruit display that you'll see on the other sumacs, but it has this fantastic textural foliage and really, really beautiful fall color. This is a plant that will work well in parking lot islands. This is it in Cambridge, Massachusetts at Fresh Pond. This is the water supply for the city of Cambridge, and I'm sure for surrounding areas as well. Parking lot on the right, road on the left. It gets all sorts of abuse. The trees they keep trying to plant keep dying, and the sumac does just fine. This is almost definitely a common cultivar called Grollo, which is a dwarf form. Grollo usually gets about 3 to maybe 4 feet tall. The natural species will do more like 5 to 6 feet tall. Both fantastic. I would, recommend the natural species when possible. That being said, there are times where a low one is needed, especially roadsides where we're looking to keep sight lines, clean for safety reasons. And in that case, I think a native cultivar is a much better option than a dead space full of nothing but red mulch or, say, non-native, invasive plants. Winged sumac, another fantastic choice. This one is not all that well behaved. It's a pretty vigorous spreader, not as strong as staghorn sumac, which will come up next. Yep. But still, a great choice. When we're talking about parking lot islands, you can't really be too vigorous. It's not going to escape the parking lot and, dig its way through the asphalt, parking lot or into the road. So something that'll just happily fill in and can get smashed and regrow readily is really quite advantageous. And that's where these sumacs are really quite wonderful. Really, really important flowers for a variety of native bees, a variety of native pollinating flies. The fruit is also a very essential wildlife benefit. The color in full puts burning bush to shame. These are fantastic plants. Clearly not a plant for just any space, but when we talk about tough conditions, these really can shine. Hypericum prolificum, this is a shrubby St. John's wort. Most people are familiar with Hypericum perforatum, which is a non-native, weedy St. John's wort that you see on roadsides. It's a herbaceous plant. This is a woody species. Depending on conditions, we'll get anywhere between 2 and I'd say maybe about 4 feet tall. Is covered in masses of these kind of nickel-sized flowers, really quite beautiful and tolerant of really challenging conditions. This is perfectly adaptable to those sunny, dry, well-drained sites. Is also perfectly fine in roadside conditions where it needs to be able to regenerate from damage and deal with, you know, say compaction and pollution. This one works quite well for that. So I've mentioned a few goldenrods already. A couple others I just want to mention real quickly. Solidago odora, sweet goldenrod. Slow growing but tolerant of very sunny, dry sites. This is the one that makes a really quite a decent tea. It's got a little bit of an anise sort of flavor to it. Quite nice. Solidago neomoralis. This is probably the shortest goldenrod of the common species. Usually doesn't get much more than 12 to 18 inches tall. This is also tolerant of sunny, dry, challenging conditions, but is also slow enough growing where either one of these can work their way into typical gardens without any trouble. Neither one of them are strong spreading. Solidago puberella. This is probably my favorite species. Love that wand-shaped flower, and the red stems will grow anywhere from sunny, dry into partial shade. You'll sometimes see this one on the edges of trails going through a woodland where it gets enough light to, you know, to kind of persist, but not nearly as much light as these other species prefer. This one is very adaptable and also very, you know, kind of good for gardens or for these kind of challenging conditions and anywhere in between. Solidago cassia, wreath goldenrod, sometimes called woodland goldenrod or bluestem goldenrod. This is the one for the shady conditions. It'll grow fine in the sun. There's just other, you know, choices for the sun, but this one is also perfectly fine growing in quite a bit of shade and will take those dry, acidic woodlands that are often very challenging to fill. I don't know why pycnanthemums are in here again. There's that muticum I mentioned earlier. I got a picture of it up. As I said, this is an old lecture. I haven't given this one in a while, so bear with me. But pycnanthemum muticum, fantastic species, probably my favorite. I'm glad we got a picture in there. Senna, we mentioned this one earlier when we were talking about right plant, right place. This is another one of those plants that ironically is quite rare in the wild and is restricted to the sort of conditions that makes you think it wouldn't be a tough plant. That being said, it will grow just about anywhere in cultivation. It does not need the moist, well-drained, rich soils that you find it growing in the wild. This will grow in parking lot islands. This will grow in sunny, dry. This will grow really anywhere. It's a pretty, you know, vigorous plant. It's going to want to form a pretty sizable patch in time. If you give it those tough conditions, it slows it down to the point where it works well in kind of meadow conditions mixed with other species. If you've got good conditions, though, this is a good one for kind of filling in areas, especially pushing back against would-be invaders. If you've got something like goutweed or stiltgrass pushing in on you, putting something like this right next to it is a really good option. This is it at Garden in the Woods. This is it in an abandoned garden without any care whatsoever. This garden did not look good. There was a lot of problems in this garden. The senna was not one of them. It was doing just fine. Okay, so something that I thought kind of fit into this kind of idea of filling tough places and tenacious plants is this idea of kind of just weeds on the landscape. You could ignore all the details in this lecture and just kind of look at the fact that when we talk about building landscapes, we're often really just referring to these upper layers and kind of missing this bottom layer. We tend to fill it up with mulch and think that that's going to kind of solve all our problems. And for those of you who kind of work on the landscape, you know that mulch is by no means the end of all weeds. So, you know, kind of put this into perspective. You know, if you built this and simply left it alone, or this for that matter, which is really just the same thing with a little more, you know, bedding annuals thrown into it, it's going to fill in. Weeds are going to find their way into these big spaces. It tends to start kind of lightly, and then this is what a lot of my vegetable gardens have looked like, you know, in the past before I really started paying more attention to them. This is something that builds over time. And oftentimes, what we tend to think we need to do is just weed and weed and weed and weed. When I'd say what is often a better goal is not necessarily weeding, though weeding clearly is an important part of things. But weeding is about solving the problem once it's established. I'd rather avoid the problem in the first place as much as that is possible. And that means filling in these spaces in between. And this is not something that's done on the landscape album. This is the wares that whoever John Holden is advertising in terms of good landscaping. And as far as I'm concerned, this is not good. This is meatballs and rocket chips, way too much mulch and way too much lawn. This is a lot of open space in between for things like that lawn to move in on, or for dandelions and chickweed and mullein, and we see this everywhere. Look, meatballs, rocket chips, red mulch. These are landscapes dominated by mulch, and not landscapes dominated by plants. This is one of Gary Smith's designs, and really the solution here to weeds is every time you pull out a weed, you replace it with another phlox. Put something in its place. Fill in those holes in between. Imagine you are the weed seed looking for a place to land here. This is an old Garden in the Woods picture from years before even I showed up there. And the idea is sound, though. Buckthorn is a much stronger grower than, say, the Asarum canadense there, the wild ginger. But the Asarum canadense will beat out buckthorn when Asarum is already established, and the buckthorn is nothing more than a seed falling out of a passing bird. Filling the landscape up with these plants, in many cases these ground covers, is a really good way to reduce the weeds' ability to get established in the first place. It won't be the end of all weeding, but it will definitely be a reduction in them. This is a young space that we were just building, and this was pretty much what we called our mulch layer.